Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, I am going to take another look at the summer of 2014 and profile a deck that I had in a mat just a few weeks ago, Sylvans. The summer of 2014, often called hat format, is one of the most popular retro formats as of the recording of this video. It is also one of the most diverse formats in recent history, at least relatively recent history. This format, of course, had hat and all of the various hat elements, whether that was fat or cat. There were other trap-heavy decks like Giorgias and Buijins and Spellbooks, more combo-centric decks like Infernities, Sylvans, which we're going to profile today. Other decks like Dragon Ruler with Light Sworns or maybe with Skill Drain, and a handful of other decks here or there. For me, the deck that stood out the most was Sylvans. I absolutely loved the deck. The deck had so many awesome plays, and when you really started to play the deck more and more, you started to understand some of the deeper levels. You started to understand, wow, if I ditch a level 8 with Urea, I can stack 8 cards off the top of my deck, sequence them just so perfectly so that when I use Urea's effect, it bounces my Miracle Fertilizers. And now that I've stacked 8 cards into my deck, I can sequence each of them perfectly to use a Hermitry effect here to draw this card. Those type of plays are just awesome. Those type of plays are really enjoyable. And one of the main things about Sylvans for me is that, yes, there were bread and butter combos. If you have Lone Fire and Soul Charge, there is a series of things that you can do, assuming you have no other extenders and your opponent has no interruptions. Sure. But oftentimes on turn 2 or 3, you're using Soul Charge and you're bringing back monsters that are a little bit different than the last time you used Soul Charge, and now you have access to 1 level 7 and two Lone Fire Blossoms, and maybe you had a Martial Leaf in the grave and you decided to bring that back, and now that Martial Leaf on the board can combo with maybe the Mount Sylvania to stack a plant at a certain point in the combo, and it just allowed you to explore all of these different decision trees that varied from game to game. And for me, I really enjoyed that non-repetitive gameplay. For me, if anyone knows me personally, you know I have a deep preference for trap-heavy decks. I really enjoyed the back-and-forth grind of 2 trap decks fighting against one another, and it's really, quite frankly, an interesting point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history for me to prefer a combo deck, because the deck that won Nationals and a deck that was arguably the best deck at the time, Hat, was obviously a very trap-heavy deck, not to mention the other trap-heavy decks like Giorgias. But I elected to push away the traps for one format and really focus on what I thought was the best combo deck at the time. If you really wanted to emphasize combo, and for me, put Soul Charge to work. I thought Soul Charge was the #1 card in the summer of 2014, and I thought this deck did the best job of all of them. More than Infernities, more than Hat, more than Dragon Ruler, of really taking advantage of Soul Charge. And without further ado, let's take a look at my top 64 deck from the 2014 US Nationals, or the North American Nationals. It is actually the only Nationals that I ever topped, so not only is Sylvans a deck that I really enjoyed running, it is actually the deck that brought me to my only Nationals top. All right, we'll start off with 3 copies of Hermitry and 3 copies of Sage Sequoia. The level 8 and level 7 gave you access to a variety of monsters from the extra deck, especially XYC monsters, but with level 7 Sage Sequoias, also level 8 Synchro monsters when we combine it with a level 1 Spore. These are the primary targets for cards like Miracle Fertilizer, obviously Lone Fire Blossom, digging out monsters from your deck, and then of course Soul Charge. So 3 copies of each of these allowed you to really play a couple different types of game plans. Like, for example, if you did not have access to some of those explosive cards like Miracle Fertilizer or Soul Charge, you could sit on these relatively large monsters, the 27 attack and 26 attack, nothing to joke about. Against hand matchups, decks with Ice and Fire Hand, a lot of times you could just sit with these in defense mode, generate card advantage every turn, because they both have the ability to excavate the top card of your deck, send it to the graveyard if it's a plant, and then it'll allow you to actually draw an additional card if it was Hermitry using that effect, which comes up with some of the combos. There are actually some ways that you can guarantee the top card of your deck is a plant monster, specifically by using Princess Sprout, but also using Sylvan Charity, and allow you to generate card advantage with the draw off Hermitry. Now we'll talk about some of the lower level Sylvan monsters. I elected to run 2 copies of Princess Sprout, 2 copies of Martial Leaf, and 2 copies of Komashrumo. Some of the builds of Sylvans cut back on some of these, particularly some of the destruction, monster and spell and trap destruction. Pat Hoban also topped this year's Nationals in 2014 with a version of Sylvans that, as I just mentioned, cut back on some of these. I liked having the 2-and-2 split because I think it allowed you to always have access to it if you were to draw one, and they're not the absolute worst starters in the world, specifically Komashrumo. Now, if you set this, yeah, there's a lot of things that your opponent could do, but if your opponent's running, let's say, Hat, Hand, Artifact, Trap Tricks, a 2000 Defense Monster is nothing to joke about. There's nothing they really can do on at least the first turn to get rid of this. They would need to go into an XYC monster. So if you open first, you get a little bit of a slow hand. You could set this and pretty reliably get the full effect of 5 off. Now, it's unlikely that they're going to attack into it because they'll likely know what it is, particularly if they know you're running Sylvans. And even if they don't know you're running Sylvans, they're probably not going to attack, for example, Traptrix Myrmelio into a potential hand or a Geargia armor, assuming that they have some type of trap. So what usually would happen is you would set this, your opponent would pass, you would flip it, and it would bait out something like a Fiendish Chain or a Warning or a Break Disco. But even then, at least you're 1-for-1ing with something, and you're using really one of the worst draws in your deck to 1-for-1 and bait out one of those back rows. And maybe, for example, you have something like Rose Archer and actually push through the effect of milling 5, or rather excavating 5, and then potentially from that point on fueling your graveyard enough to win with something like Soul Shard. So Coma Shroom was one of those interesting cards that you really always wanted to have access to. You didn't really want to draw, but even when you sometimes did draw it, if your hand wasn't great, the set flip was really dangerous and something your opponent had to respect. The Martial Leaf, obviously a monster destruction effect was really important. I liked having access to 2. This deck can always stack the one that you need with Mount Sylvania and then activate any of the various Sylvan effects to excavate it and then get the destruction effect. So you very oftentimes would destroy something right when you needed it because you had Mount Sylvania. The Martial Leaf also had a normal summon effect where you could excavate the top 2 cards of your deck, 1 or 2, virtually always 2. You could theoretically stack the top of your deck so that there's a Princess Spread on the top, and then you can mill it and get it as a level 3 and then be able to go into a XYC with a rank 3, which isn't always the best, but it is something that you could do. You could also know that you have Spore on top, and then summon it, mill the Spore, banish something from the graveyard, and use Martial Leaf plus the Spore. Maybe the Spore is a level 4, and then Black Rose the field, for example. So there were ways that the Martial Leaf draw wasn't the absolute end of the world either. And I think this deck benefited from having access to both 2 Coma Shrumos and 2 Martial Leafs for the destruction effect. Then that brings us with Princess Sprout. So Princess Sprout has 2 effects, and you can use both of them on the same turn. The first one is when you have it normal summon, and this is the worst case scenario really, but you can normal summon it, use the effect to excavate the top card of your deck, and then put a Sprout monster from your graveyard on top of your deck, which is usually itself. Though there are other Sprouts in the deck, though you usually don't actually want to put Cherub Sprout on top if you've already used its effect, but that's the first effect. The second effect is when it is excavated, you can special summon it to the field with any level that you want. Oftentimes that's level 8, but sometimes it's also level 7. So for example, if this is on the top of your deck and you have Hermitry on the board, you can excavate the top card. You know it's going to be Princess Sprout. Maybe you put it there from its own effect. Maybe you put it there because of a Sylvan Charity or a Mount Sylvania. Goes to the graveyard, comes to the field, you make it a level 8. You actually get a draw off the Hermitry, because when you excavate a plant off Hermitry, you draw a card, and now have the ability to go into a rank 8, which is obviously really powerful. Same can then be true if it's actually Sage on the board. Instead of making it come to the field as a level 8, you make it come to the field as a level 7, and then you can overlay into a rank 7, which is obviously really good. You also can manipulate the level to make it so that it lines up with some of your tuners, right? The deck has Spore in the deck, which is the only tuner, other than sometimes Effect Veiler, but primarily Spore, and you can make it so that if you needed a level 2, 3, 4, 5, depending on what you wanted to go into. So kind of an annoying card to draw, because that first effect to just normal summon it and put it on top of the deck is not the greatest, but it's also not the end of the world. And you don't even necessarily need to normal summon it for that effect to happen. Like, for example, if you soul charge this back, you can do the stack effect. And when I'm talking about the stack effect, I mean, you soul charge this to the board. Let's say you soul charge both of these. Use this effect, excavate the top card, put Princess Spread on top. Now you know that there is a plant on top. You get to mill it, draw a card, and then get a level 8 and go into a rank 8. So you don't necessarily always have to normal summon it to get that effect. Oftentimes you actually prefer to special summon it from the graveyard to get that stack effect, but it is there. It's not really much of a starter. That's kind of why I'm making this point. A card like Coma Shroom is a little bit of a starter because it threatens the mill 5 or the excavate 5. Milling 1 off a Princess Sprout is not really much of a starting play. You really never want to do that. Ideally, these are just in your deck or in your graveyard, but that's so far the Sylvan package. And then the only other Sylvan in the deck is Cherub Spread. A lot of people cut this card, but I did like it. It's easily the worst one to draw because it no way, shape, or form even remotely close to a starter. At least Princess Sprout, there's some application. Like you can go summon Princess Sprout, use that excavate effect, and summon Sage to at least put a big body on the board. You can't restack the Sprout to do that, but you can at least put the 26 on the board. With Cherub Sprout, there's really no starting play with it. Its excavation effect only happens when it's special summoned, but when it is excavated. So I'm talking about you mill it off Hermitry, Sage, or any of the other effects in the deck. It allows you to special summon a level 1 plant from your deck, which more often than not means you're special summoning out a Spore, which is awesome. It allows you to use the Spore as a level 1, and then it obviously will go to the graveyard, and then you can use Spore as whatever level that you have access to, depending on the plants in your graveyard. So that one Princess Sprout I thought or rather the one Cherub spread I thought was really good. You also have cards like Sylvania and Sylvan Charity, so you can always put it on the top of your deck when you want it there. So I think it came up quite frequently where a lot of the combos that you would do really required you'd have access to this. But those are the Sylvans in the main deck. To support the Sylvan package, we have 2 copies of Lone Fire Blossom, easily the best monster in the deck. You always want to see Lone Fire Blossom. It was semi-limited to 2, so we don't get the full playset, or else we would have ran cards like Symbol of Heritage, and I can just imagine what triple Lone Fire plus Soul Charge would have ended with. But double Low Fire with Soul Charge was plenty good enough. It allowed you to go into rank 8 and a level 8 Synchro if you wanted, or rank 8 and then a Hermitry plus a Spore in the graveyard that you've yet to use. I can show you some of those combos as we go. But the double Lone Fire Blossom really dug out any of the cards that you needed, whether it was a big monster. Sometimes you would dig out the Sprout so that you could do what I was talking about earlier, where you stack it on top and then use something already on the board. It was one of the best ways, obviously, to fuel Soul Charge, putting 2 monsters in the graveyard immediately. And not only just randomly 2 monsters that tutor anything else in the deck, so it's by far one of the most important cards in the deck. Another starter that you really loved to see early on, it obviously started to dwindle in use as the game progressed, but definitely something that you loved to see early on was Curry Bandit. This deck has a ton of spell and trap, so it's very rare that you're going to miss on the effect. And honestly, even if you miss on the effect, that just means that you milled 5 plants or pretty close to it. All of these effects are going to trigger if you mill them. So for example, you could theoretically summon this on the first turn, use the effect, hit a Hermitry, a Sage, pop a back row, special summon a monster, and you can very easily generate almost insurmountable card advantage on that first turn. I can remember going back to some of the events where I played this deck, where you'd have a pretty mediocre opening hand. Maybe you did have something like Soul Charge in your hand, but nothing to revive. So you just summon the Curry Bandit and use the effect, and you'd hit like a Hermitry to stack the next 3 draws. You hit Sylvan Charity, but you also hit Sage, so you didn't need to pick the Charity. The Sage would bring it back. And you would hit something like a Princess Sprout so that you would automatically have a monster on board, and then maybe you'd hit a Miracle Fertilizer. So you basically added 2 cards to your hand, the Charity off of the Sage, the Miracle Fertilizer off the Curry Bandit. You stacked your next 3 draws, put a monster on the board to sort of block the next attack, and your graveyard was fueled for your Soul Charge / your Miracle Fertilizer on the next turn, and it basically won you the game. Obviously, there's a lot of things that can happen. If you summon Curry Bandit, your opponent can just flip Artifact Sanctum, pop it with Moral Tech. They can negate the effect. I mean, there are a lot of things that can happen to Curry Bandit, but it is something that baits things out. And if the game is going to go a long time, it is one of those must-answer cards if your opponent's unwilling to risk the possibility of you hitting a really incredible 5 cards off the top. So these are sort of the typical starters that you really want to see on the opening turn. We had Spore. I commented on Spore a little bit. You tutor it out with Lone Fire. You can tutor it out with Cherub Sprout. A lot of the combos ended with utilizing Spore, banishing a Sage to make it a level 8, to make it so that you can go into a rank 8, or just using it as a simple level 1 tuner with Sage to go into level 8 synchros, which are really good. This deck had 2 copies of Rose Archer. Rose Archer is a card that was really exclusive to this deck. There was really no other deck at the time, and I'm really not quite sure if any other deck since then that really used Rose Archer, but it's a pretty cool effect in a format like this. Basically, if you control a face-up plant monster, you can discard Rose Archer to negate a trap card. Negate and destroy, so there are some trap cards that's annoying. Things like Artifact Sanctum does have an effect when it is destroyed. But if your opponent, for example, flipped Vanity's Emptiness when you had a plant on the board, you could discard this to destroy the emptiness. Obviously, that's really good. Your opponent flips a Breakthrough Skill, what you would consider a back-breaking Breakthrough Skill. That's really a good choke point. Nope. You discard Rose Archer, negate. Bottomless, Rose Archer, negate. Trap Tricks, Trap Hole Nightmare, very common one. Discard Rose Archer, negate. Any trap card you can discard Rose Archer and negate it. Basically allowed you to play through a lot of what your opponent had. It's a level 3, which is a little bit annoying. Really, the level 3 only matters depending on how you construct your extra deck with a couple cards. So it didn't have a lot of utility there. And like Valoret's not a tuner, so it doesn't have utility there. But I think more often than not, when you drew this card, you were generally pretty happy. Most of the decks ran trap cards. Granted, the Mirror Match didn't. But even decks with few traps, like, for example, the Lightsworn deck at the time, the Dark Ruler Lightsworn deck, if you stopped the Needlebug Nest, that's what it was called, the card that just said mill 5, that was actually really good. That could actually slow them down. So double Rose Archer was really good. I liked it to run double Maxi at Nationals and for most of this format. I liked the Maxi because it at least 1-for-1 to Artifact Sanctum. It 1-for-1 to Diana. So even against the decks that quote-unquote didn't special summon, it at least had a lot of 1-for-1s. And honestly, some of the Artifact decks special summoned a lot when we're talking about combos with Beagle Tech. So it actually did pretty good there. And then obviously it's fantastic against Sylvans. It can be pretty good against Lightsworns. It can be pretty good against some of the other special summon heavy decks like Mermills. So I really liked Maxi as opposed to a card like Effect Veiler, because at least Maxi always 1-for-1. Effect Veiler is one of those cards where, you know, if you Effect Veiler a Traptrix Mammalia, do you really feel good about that? Generally speaking, I don't think so. I think you're fine if they just go and get a random trap card. You can play through it. Now, if you Maxi off of a Sanctum and you at least 1-for-1 there, I feel a little bit better about that transaction. So, double Maxi, and then 1 copy of Blaster. This deck does have a lot of fire monsters. It has the 3 Hermitries, it has the 2 Komashroomos, and it has the 2 Lone Fire Blossoms. So you actually do get to the point of banishing 2 fires to special summon it. But it's also an out to some of the problem cards. For example, if your opponent has Vanity's Emptiness, or your opponent has some type of frustrating Floodgate, you have a variety of fire monsters that you can discard in combination with the Blaster to just destroy something. So it's one of those cards that the level mattered. Level 7 really matters in this deck. Combines with Spore to make level 8 Synchros. Combines with Sage to make level 7 or rank 7s. There's a bunch of fire monsters. So it's really one of those cards that fit in really well with this deck. So having access to a Dragon Ruler was awesome. It's also a card that you can mill with Curry Bandit. Next, and I think this is really what made the deck, was the robust spell lineup. We have 3 copies of Miracle Fertilizer. The only card that this really conflicts with is Lone Fire Blossom. You can't normal summon the turn that you use Miracle Fertilizer, so sometimes your turns really have 2 different courses of action. It's either a turn, really 3 quite frankly. An opener turn, a setup turn. I'm talking about using Curry Bandit, setting Komashrumo, just going Lone Fire, Hermitry, Pass, something that sets you up. Then you're either going off with Miracle Fertilizer. In turns where you go off with Miracle Fertilizer, your graveyard's filled, and really your main objective is to utilize Miracle Fertilizer as many times in 1 turn as possible. This deck had access to Urea, the Link monster, or rather the Exceed monster that allowed you to bounce cards on the field to your hand. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the extra deck. And one of the main things that you would try and do is utilize its effect to not necessarily bounce your opponent's cards, which can be useful, particularly non-targeting, but bouncing your own Miracle Fertilizer so that you can activate them multiple times per turn. Really, the goal is to activate Miracle Fertilizer as many times in a turn as possible. Always considering at the end of the day, though, that you're not getting your normal summon. Another interesting thing about Miracle Fertilizer, in theory, the downside with this card is if the monster leaves the field and Miracle Fertilizer is destroyed. That would be the case if you Synchro Summon. That would destroy the Miracle Fertilizer if you Synchro Summon with the monster that you revived. But if you go into an Exceed monster, and this is the important part, the Miracle Fertilizer would remain on the board. So, for example, if you brought back a Sage, banished for Blaster, and went into Urea, 2 level 7s, the Fertilizer would remain on the board, so that when you used Urea's effect to bounce cards to the hands of either the opponent or you, of course, the Fertilizer would go back to your hand, even though you used the effect that turn, because the monster didn't, quote-unquote, leave the field in the traditional way, due to the ruling according to the XYZ monster and their mechanics, and then you could just use Miracle Fertilizer again and bring back whether it was that Sage or something else. So Miracle Fertilizer, absolutely one of the most important cards in the deck. The turn that you're going to use it, obviously you can't Lone Fire Blossom, unless Lone Fire's in the graveyard, but nevertheless, on turns 2 and 3, after you've set up a little bit, absolutely backbreaking. The card that was even more backbreaking, of course, is Soul Charge. You obviously would max out on the triple Soul Charge. Every game you sat down, going first, you were really hoping, I really want to see Lone Fire Soul Charge. Lone Fire Soul Charge, assuming the other 4 cards or 3 cards in your hand, depending on when you're playing. At Nationals, you would have 6 cards in your opening hand, so let's say at Nationals. If you open Soul Charge Lone Fire, you had a couple different options, assuming the other 4 cards in your hand were all bricks or cards that had no effect at that point. You could go into a rank 8, which was usually Felgrand, plus a level 8 Synchro if you're willing to use your Spore effect that turn, which is usually Spark Dragon, start a Spark Dragon, or you could just go Felgrand and then leave Hermitry on the board, depending on your perspective on the matchup. Maybe you value the Hermitry effect more than you do the Spark Dragon, and then leave Spore in the graveyard for later. I can talk a little bit about those combos as we go. But even if you're not opening Soul Charge Lone Fire, this card is always just backbreaking. This deck has the ability to really exploit the ability of putting a bunch of monsters on the field by getting Urea and Alcay and then bouncing cards at the top of your opponent's deck. I mean, the plays that you can do with Soul Charge are just absolutely crippling. So the triple Soul Charge really powerful, and unlike Miracle Fertilizer, you can normal summon the turn you use it, so you could go Lone Fire, get Lone Fire, get Hermitry, and then Soul Charge with 2 Lone Fires. What's even better is when you can combine both of these. Like, let's say, for example, turn 2 and 3, you've done your setup, you played your Curry Bandits, your Lone Fires are in the graveyard, and now you can Miracle Fertilizer and Soul Charge, you're probably going to win. Probably going to win. My favorite card in this deck, and really one of my favorite cards in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is Sylvan Charity. What this card does for this deck is just unbelievable. It allows you to draw 3, put 2 cards at the top of your deck. At least one of them needs to be a Sylvan card, so it can be either Sylvan Charity itself, Mount Sylvania, or any of the Sylvan monsters. And what that ensures is that when you utilize your Sylvan effects, you guarantee that the top card of your deck is something that you put there. Now, you can't necessarily always guarantee that it's a good one, but let's say, for example, you had a Hermitry in your hand, now you put it at the top of your deck. You use the Sylvan effect, you know the Hermitry is there. Now you get to stack the top 3 cards of your deck, and you put the Hermitry in the graveyard to be revived with one of your 3 Soul Charges, or 3 Miracle Fertilizers, or 3 Soul Charges. What Sylvan Charity does for this deck is absolutely ludicrous. You can hold this to the perfect part of your turn where you've special summoned everything out with Lone Fire Blossom. You're not going to go back into your deck. Now you can use the Charity to stack certain things on the top of your deck, and then use these Hermitries to stack multiple cards down so that when you use something like Alcé or Urea, you know the effect is going to go off. It's really just crippling when you get to see Sylvan Charity used to its full potential. So Sylvan Charity, if those of you who watch my videos are familiar with Magic the Gathering, it's basically Brainstorm. Anyone who's ever played with Brainstorm knows Brainstorm's a pretty good card. Well, Sylvan Charity is the Yu-Gi-Oh! Equivalent. This deck ran 3 copies of Mount Sylvania. At least I did at Nationals. Pat Hoban ran 2 copies of Mount Sylvania and 2 copies of Terraforming, and I think that was probably a reasonable idea. The only downfall with that split is that if you use Charity and you draw Terraforming as opposed to Mount Sylvania, and having drawn Mount Sylvania changes your mind in terms of what you want to put on top of your deck, where you tell yourself, wow, I'd rather put Mount Sylvania on top of my deck as opposed to something else. Like maybe, for example, you're shuffling your deck with Lone Fire Blossom, and now you're trying to put cards back into your deck so you don't draw them. But now it's Terraforming, not Mount Sylvania. That could be a little bit frustrating. I never considered Terraforming at the time. It wasn't until I saw Pat's deck at Nationals that I ever considered it. But at least for me, I ran triple Mount Sylvania at Nationals. I could easily see the correct ratio being 2 of these and 1 Terraforming to slim your deck a little bit. But nevertheless, triple Mount Sylvania. This card allowed you to ditch a plant from your field or your hand to stack a plant or Sylvan card, which does matter. Sometimes you put Charity on top of your deck. Allows you to stack it to the top of your deck. That really matters because if you're using any of the Sylvan effects, whether that's something like Sage or Hermitry or even Martial Leaf when the situation matters, or that's warranted, you guarantee that the top card of your deck is not only just a plant or Sylvan, specifically the one you want. So maybe that's a Sage so you can bounce Charity back. Maybe that's Princess Sprout so you can make a level 7 or 8. Maybe that's a Martial Leaf or a Komishruma to destroy a card on the field. Maybe, for example, you put Charity on top of the deck and then you summoned Alcé. Alcé has an effect where you can call out the card on top of your deck, and if it matches that, you get to add it to your hand. So maybe you call out Charity because you know it's on top and just put Alcé or put Charity in your hand because of Alcé's effect. That came up a lot. Additionally, during your opponent's end phase, you get to look at the top card of your deck. If it's a plant, you can send it to the graveyard. If it's not, you can decide if it goes on the top or bottom, so you can start to filter out your draws. And honestly, sometimes get random card advantage. Like, for example, during the end phase, you might mill a Martial Leaf and then randomly pop something, which is really useful, of course. Fueling the graveyard, getting rid of what's not a really great draw in Martial Leaf, and then allowing you at the same time to filter out your draw. So triple Mount Sylvania. It's also a Sylvan card, so you can put it back on top with Sylvan Charity. That really came up. This deck is 40 cards, and to ensure that we get to the combo, we always play 3 copies of Upstart Goblin. All 3 ofs in this spell lineup. Pretty cool. What made my deck a little bit different than other decks is in the main deck, I actually ran at Nationals 2 copies of Rivalry of Warlords. A lot of people who ran Sylvans would use the trap spots for something like Vanity's Emptiness. Pat Hoban, when he topped at Nationals, ran 2 copies of Vanity's Emptiness. I prefer Rivalry of Warlords because I think, other than the mirror match, Rivalry of Warlords slows down all of the same things that Emptiness does, and Emptiness isn't nearly as fragile. So, for example, you play Emptiness, your opponent MSTs the Mount Sylvania, and now your Emptiness dies, and you're kind of upset about it. If, for one reason or another, your opponent breaks your board, they play Dark Hole, next thing you know, your Emptiness dies, your board just got broken, and then you might lose. Well, if your opponent Dark Holes you, but you still have Rivalry of Warlords on the board, you're still utilizing a floodgate that might be stopping their significant plays. And this deck, by and large, can play through Rivalry of Warlords. Yes, I can't now go into Stardust Spark Dragon, I can't go into Draco Sack, Big Eye, some of the really powerful cards in the extra deck, but I can go into Alcé, and I can go into Urea. So this deck had 2 really useful monsters from the extra deck. And not only that, Urea can actually bounce the Rivalry of Warlords. So if you're going for an OTK, you summon Urea, you use the effect, you mill 2 or 3 plant monsters. It allows you to bounce that many cards to the owner's hand. You could theoretically bounce your own Rivalry and then continue off into an OTK. It didn't come up a lot because to go into Urea, a lot of times that involves Soul Charge, which obviously means you're not OTKing. But it's something that you could consider. Like, let's say Urea just sat on the field for a few turns. Maybe you did Soul Charge it 1 turn, and then the next turn you do the play to bounce your Rivalries. That's totally possible. So that you can start to go into other types of monsters. But even so, you can easily win the game with Hermitry and Defense Rivalry face up. You can sit there and just hermitry every turn, milling plants, getting card advantage, stacking cards with Charity, and eventually grinding your opponent out. And at the same time, having a card in your deck the opponent really has to respect. Rivalry of Warlords. It's a card not a lot of people expected, quite frankly. It was more often than not in the side deck, but I won a lot of games at Nationals in the main deck with this card, because your opponent, they might be thinking about Emptiness in the back of their mind, but Emptiness when your opponent doesn't have an established board isn't really that threatening, because now the Sylvan player can't special summon. What your opponent might not anticipate is when you go, let's say, T-set turn 1, right? So I'm talking Komashrumo Rivalry, and your opponent's like, wow, they opened really slow. I'm going to make a play, make a special summon, and then you flip Rivalry. Now your opponent's stuck with a tuner and a non-tuner, or 2 monsters that can't go into a certain Exceed monster. Now you have Komashrumo face down that's hard to deal with. I won a lot of games because of Rivalry. It was a really, really powerful card. It's also a card that your opponent has to respect in games 2 and 3. Not that they wouldn't anticipate a card like that anyway, but they have to keep something like MST in their deck, which is better than you think against this deck. It's actually pretty good against this deck. But if you draw the type of hand where you don't rely on Miracle Fertilizer, or you don't rely on Rivalry or Mount, you could easily win the game and your opponent's sitting there with dead MSTs. And now don't get me wrong, MST is a card you definitely side in this deck because of Mount Sylvania and Miracle Fertilizer, but this deck can also easily just go Soul Charge Lone Fire and never care about Spell and Traps the whole game, and your opponent loses the game because of it. But your opponent needed those cards in their deck games 2 and 3 anyway, because they didn't want to lose to Rivalry, and they didn't want to lose to Sylvania, Mount Sylvania, Miracle Fertilizer. In terms of the extra deck, we have one, I'm going to call it lower level monster with the Mech Angled Angineer. This was definitely a flex position. This wasn't the staple. Pat didn't run this at Nationals. I liked this card for a few different reasons. There are some fields that you end where you want to protect, let's say, an Alcé or an Urea, or even in some cases a Spark Dragon or Felgrand. And this one was a decent one because it was a card that played around the hands. It had 1800 attack, but when you used the effect, you could select a monster on your board, shift it to defense mode, now it can't be destroyed this turn, and that was a way to make sure your opponent can't crash their hands into your monsters. It also allowed you to, make some plays with cards like Spore, or some of the really awkward hands that you draw, where you want to soul charge a lot out, but if your opponent hits you with a hand trap at a certain point, you're going to be left with monsters on the board, and as a result, now your opponent can take advantage of that, but you can use 2 level 3s that are sitting there, maybe a Rose Archer that you brought back off a Soul Charge and actually go into something that's pretty useful. So I had a lot of games where Angineer was really useful. From that point on, we're going to be looking at a lot of higher level Exceed monsters. For the level 7s, we have Urea, which is easily the most important one. So important that Pat actually ran multiple copies at Nationals. I never found a situation where I needed more than one, but I can totally understand having more than one. Its effect is just backbreaking. It allows you to ditch a plant in your hand to look at the level equivalent cards on top of your deck. So let's say you had Hermitry in your hand. That means you can look at the top 8 cards of your deck and stack them in any order you want, which is just ludicrous. Then you can use the effect to detach mill 3 and then bounce cards to the owner's hand equal to the number of plants that you excavated, which oftentimes means bouncing Miracle Fertilizer to your hand and then utilizing it for a second time that turn. Sometimes if you have something like double Fertilizer on the board, now you're activating Miracle Fertilizer 4, 5, 6 times in a turn, so it's just absolutely crazy backbreaking. 25 defense is no joke. Let's say you Soul Charge, you could just leave this in defense, threaten the effect on the next turn, just backbreaking. Big Eye, this deck has the ability to go into it, so because we do, we'll include Big Eye. Same is true with Dracosac. We have the ability to go into rank 7s with a variety of level 7s in the deck, so of course we'll use it. From that point on, for rank 8s, we had Puppet Grinder, this card in a format where a lot of people going into ranks, a lot of people going to XYZ monsters. It's a really powerful card. The burn damage is really important. You can OTK out of nowhere. It doesn't necessarily have to destroy just Exceed monsters. You can destroy other type of monsters as well that have been special summoned, so really useful. My favorite card in the deck was Alcé. I absolutely adored Alcé. You really have 2 effects here. In some cases, even 3 if your opponent's not fully in tune with what's going on. One, it has 32 defense, which is just absurd. The first effect is you can call the top card of your deck. If it is that card, add it to your hand. So when you're stacking cards with Mount Sylvania, Sylvan Charity, and some of the other effects in the deck, like Hermitry, and even Urea to a lesser extent, you can guarantee that the top card of your deck is what you want. And in some cases, what you would often do is if you were blindly going to use Alcé's effect, sometimes you would just call the biggest blowout card in your deck, like Maxi, Rivalry of Warlords, Emptiness, if you were playing it on the off chance that it happened to be on the top of your deck. Or if you don't need those blowout cards, you figure out what card in your deck is still there that's a 3 of, and you would just call it. All of that was fantastic. Beyond that, though, when a monster or a card rather is excavated, Any card, doesn't necessarily even have to be a plant. When a card is excavated, you can detach one of the two materials and then spin a card on the field to the top of your opponent's deck or the bottom of your opponent's deck. I basically always did the top of my opponent's deck. I can't think of any situation where I spun something to the bottom. But the reason that's really good is if your opponent has a dead artifact that you know is there, or a monster on the board that you know is not doing anything, or it's a mirror match, they have a Mount Sylvania or any type of other field spell. Maybe you're playing against Giorlando and they have a set armor, which is kind of a whatever draw. You can spin those cards to the top of your opponent's deck and you're guaranteeing that the top card of the deck is dead. The really perfect turn is when you use Alcé and you get that first effect to go off freely. So you call the card on the top of your deck, it is correct, and you add it to your hand. And then later in the turn, you get another Sylvan effect to go off so that you can do the detach effect. Because technically you can call the top card of your deck. And if you need the spin effect to go off, you could call Exodia the Forbidden One, which is obviously not going to be the top card of your deck. Which means regardless of the top card of your deck, it's going to be sent to the graveyard, which would then allow you to use the Alcé effect to spin something. That's worst case scenario, where you have to use the calling effect of Alcé to get the second effect to go off. The best case scenario is when you call the first card, add it to your hand, and then later in your combo, trigger the second effect. That's really the end game. The reason I said this kind has three effects, though, is people don't typically realize that during the end phase, when you have Mount Sylvania on the field, you're allowed to, of course, look at the top card of your deck and send it to the graveyard if it's a plant. There were many times where during the end phase, my opponent would, all right, let's go. We're going to try and come back. I'm going to set some trap cards. My opponent did their big soul charge play. I have a trap card that deals with Alcé. We can get back into this game. In end phase, you go Mount. Reveal a plant, send it to the grave. Alcé during the opponent's end phase, because this effect can be triggered whenever a monster is excavated or plant. Any card, really. It doesn't even have to be a plant. Any card, but it would be a plant with Mount Sylvania. And now during the opponent's turn, you're triggering your Alcé to spin a trap that they just set to the top of their deck. Obviously, now they're going to have to redraw it on the next turn. Now it's passing to you, and you're probably going to be able to win. So this deck, absolutely crazy in that sense, where this card had just such a back-breaking effect. And a lot of people didn't realize that end phase interaction with Mount Sylvania. It'd take a lot of people by surprise. The one that you most often went to is Felgrand. A lot of people ran 2 Felgrands. There were some events where I ran 2 Felgrands. I eventually elected only to run 1, because I didn't go into 2 frequently enough, but the 1 copy of Felgrand, sort of the bread and butter turn 1 combo involves going into Felgrand. As the typical rank 8, it's one of those cards that's really good because it does a decent job playing around the hat matchup, obviously against the hands. Obviously, it can just be used against something like Trap Turks Marmelio or any of the other simple normal summons that could occur in the format. So obviously really good. And then 1 copy of the Hieratic Dragon. This card allowed you to push through some OTKs out of nowhere. 2 level 8 monsters. This deck has a bunch of level 8s. Sometimes what you would do is you would soul charge, and then you'd bring out a bunch of sort of lingering random monsters. I'm talking about a Maxi, a Rose Archer, and it allows you to tribute even those, and then destroy cards in your opponent's field non-targeting equal to the number of monsters that you tributed. So sometimes even just soul charge for double lone fire, 3 bad monsters. Worst case scenario, you can go 2 level 8s into this, tribute off the 3 random bad creatures, Rose Archer, Maxi, etc., destroy 3 cards in the field. Really, really powerful. Allowed you to OTK. Maybe not that turn, but set up an OTK on the following turn. This deck also, because of the single copy of Spore, had a pretty robust synchro lineup. We had 1 copy of Armory Arm. Armory Arm is the result of Spore plus any level 3. This deck does have a lot of level 3s, so I found Spore to be pretty useful in combination with Armory Arm. Then we're going to jump all the way up to level 7s. 1 copy of Black Rose Dragon. This deck can, in fact, go into Black Rose Dragon pretty reasonably. Spore, Banishing Lonefire is obviously level 4, plus a Spore left on the field, plus a Rose Archer on the board. I mean, when you're talking about Soul Charge, you can basically get into any level you want. And then when you combine that with Princess Sprout, you literally can go into any level you want. So Black Rose could happen really whenever you needed it to. Level 8s, we had Crimson Blader, which was really useful in the mirror match. If your opponent can't special summon their own Hermitry or Sage for a turn, you're probably going to win. Good against Mermills if they can't summon Megalo or Abystius. You're stopping your opponent from using their extra deck. Probably means you're going to win against other matchups too, like Lightsworn. This was really good. You attack, now your opponent can't Dragon Ruler you the next turn. They can't Judgment Dragon you the next turn. Really good in that matchup as well. So had a lot of utility against even the non-Lightsworn Dragon Ruler deck. So I'm talking about the Mythic Water, Mythic Tree Dragon, the deck that Timid used at Nationals that year, the deck with Skill Drain, basically Skill Drain Rulers. Same deal, you attack over a dragon or anything, and now they can't Dragon Ruler you for a turn, means they can't Blue Eyes you for the turn. Stops them from special summoning a lot of the monsters that this deck has trouble dealing with. Then we had the other level 8s. We had a Spark Dragon. Some events I used actual Stardust Dragon, but I found Spark Dragon to be better, specifically in the second and third game when you bring in Royal Decree. If you go Spark Dragon Decree against some of the trap heavy decks, they have a really difficult time dealing with that, particularly if you went first. So Spark Dragon, Scrap Dragon, just sort of that utility spot where if you need to destroy something, obviously you have the ability to do so. Ditching, whether it's a Mount Sylvania or a random plant that you revived off of something, so that single Scrap Dragon is really useful. The next two are slots that I use, but they definitely weren't staple. I have a Leo and a Star Eater. These are for those corner cases where you have a difficult time getting out of the early game, but you have access to Spore and then some of the big trees. I'm talking Hermitry and Sage in the graveyard, and then you banish a Spore, and now your Spore is level 8, your Spore is level 9, your Spore has these really ridiculous levels. Well, what are you going to do with it? Well, if you have a small monster on the board, you can go into these. Conversely, if you banish, let's say, Princess Sprout from your graveyard, so Princess Sprout's a level 1, you banish it for Spore, now your Spore's a level 2, now you can start to go into Leo and Star Eater, more particularly Leo, matching up with the Sages and the Hermitries in your field. So it allowed you to go into synchro monsters that your opponent might not necessarily expect you always have access to. I don't think Pat ran these, but a lot of Sylvan players did have these sort of high-level corner cases when you didn't really have the ideal hand where you're going into things like Felground and Alcé, but you have access to Spore and you're trying to get out of the early game, and these monsters aren't anything to laugh at. Leo and Star Eater are very reasonable cards. All right, let's first talk about some of the decks at the time before we get into the side deck. First, of course, we have Trap Tricks and Artifact decks. This engine was one of the most potent trap engines at the time. Obviously, Myrmelio Searching Bottomless, and then the artifacts were then combined with either Hands to make Hat, Fire Fists to make Fat, or Curry Bandit to make Cat. Usually you had these two with one of the bottom row, being one of the most popular trap decks at the time. So I'll put this giant pile for Hat, Cat, and Fat all in one row here at the top. Then, of course, we have Mermills, top deck at the time. Really useful, having access to one copy of Title when your deck is all water, and then also have level 7s. We have Infernities, which won the 2014 World Championship at the hands of Sahabi. That was also the deck that brought him there. So, of course, we have Infernities, a really scary combo deck. We have Lightsworns, which at the time utilized Eclipse Wyvern with the 4 Dragon Rulers in order to, of course, when Wyvern gets sent to the graveyard, banish a card like Judgment Dragon or Light Ray Diabolos, and then search it once Eclipse Wyvern is banished for the Lightsworn, for the effect of a Dragon Ruler. So really potent combo right there. Another really popular trap deck at the time were Gears and Hands with the artifacts were really two of the better trap decks at the time, these two. So of course we have Gears, another really popular deck. We have the remnants of Spellbooks. Spellbooks did in fact top 64 at the National Championship, at least the North American World Championship qualifier. The deck doesn't have Spellbook of Judgment anymore, but if you watched the video from a few weeks ago where I played Alex, this is still a very potent deck. The deck has a lot of card advantage. Cards like Tower, when they're not dealt with, can kind of run away with the game. So we have the remnants of Spellbooks. We also, I guess I'm going to use the word remnants, but quite frankly, even with one Dragon Ruler each, the Dragon Ruler deck at the time is really good. The Dragon Ruler deck at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, you only had access to one of these, so we're past the point of Full Blown with the babies, past the point of Dragon Ravine with these at 3. Each of these were limited to 1, and the deck was a really trap-heavy deck with things like Skill Drain and Wing Blast, usually combined with the Blue Eyes package with cards of consonance. So we have Dragon Rulers, and then, of course, we have Buisians. I don't actually own any cards that are technically Buisians, but these are cards that were in that deck. That was another pretty trap-heavy deck. A copy of that did, in fact, top 64. It was actually a deck that I played in the final round of Swish that year, where I actually ended up going into a draw with someone running Buisians in that round. We had a really long match. That deck with Kaiser Cosline can really slow the games down. But we have Buisians, and then, of course, we have the Mirror Match. So I'll put these here to represent the Mirror Match. So very diverse field. You had a good chunk of trap decks with the top row here, plus Gears, some combo decks like Sylvans, and Infernities. Dragon Ruler also a trap deck. Honestly, Spellbook's quite a trap deck too. And then some somewhat aggressive decks that kind of fit in between the two, like Mermills and then Lightsworns. For me, I thought my side deck was pretty cool. The first card I side decked, and this isn't a joke, at Nationals, was 2 copies of Archlord Christia. And I'm going to skip the other monsters to go with 2 of the spells. 2 copies of Trade-In. Yes, I actually had these in my side deck at Nationals. Why in the world? Well, this deck has 3 level 8s, Hermitry. When you have triple Hermitry and double Archlord Christia in your deck, you have a reasonable amount of trade-in targets. And if you ever trade in Hermitry, that's really good. Putting a good level 8 in the graveyard, drawing a couple cards, that's really good. Why, though, would I play Christia? Well, against Lightsworns and even some of the other decks like Infernities, Archlord Christia is obviously a floodgate, really difficult to deal with, but it's also a card that you can very easily soul charge back. Now, when you soul charge Christia, you can't keep special summoning, but oftentimes just soul charging Christia is good enough to win. Specifically against Lightsworns, though, the Lightsworn deck basically had 2 outs in their deck, Raikou effect and then getting an Honest effect off. Other than that, they had no out in their entire deck for Archlord Christia, particularly in games 2 and 3. Your opponent's not going to anticipate Christia. They might anticipate Light Imprisoning Mirror and have MST in their deck, but they're not going to have outs to Archlord Christia in their main deck for games 2 and 3. I can vividly recall, I think it was around something like 8 or 9 at that year's Nationals. Game 2, I won game 1, my opponent does their turn 1, pretty pedestrian Lightsworn turn. And then I just go trade in Christia, soul charge Christia. My opponent just looks at it and says, well, I have like no outs to that. Game progressed a little bit. I was attacking over their set. You know, they set Arceus, I attacked over it. They set Garoth, I attacked over it. They set Lumina. Eventually, I grinded them out and just attacked for game. And Archlord Christia, simply just being soul charged on the first turn, won the game because their deck literally had no outs to it. So the double trade in, double Christia package was really useful. And you don't necessarily need to draw trade in for this to work. If you soul charge 5 monsters, even just 2 monsters, you can just tribute summon for Christia. And in that sense, you actually can go off and make some synchro plays. It's almost sometimes even better not to do the trade-in, where if you filled your graveyard up with Lone Fire, you can end with something like Spark Dragon Christia. Very easy for this deck to pull off. Then the Lightsworn deck has actually no outs to that. So that was what that was for. It was also really good against things like Infernities and other special summon heavy decks. Mirror Match 2. In the Mirror Match, if your opponent does trade in Christia, you really don't have many outs other than Blaster. That's a pretty fringy out. Then we had 2 copies of DD Crow. This was for the Mirror Match and some of the other matchups, like Infernities. 3 copies of MST. There were obviously a lot of trap-heavy decks here. We need outs to Kaiser Coliseum. It's good against Hat. It's good against Skill Drain out of the Dragon Ruler matchup. It's good against the Tower. You chain it to Tower's effect, so that way they don't special summon a spellcaster from the deck. I'm talking about during standby phase. Pretty good against Gears, good against cards like Fiendish Chain, so Triple Typhoon, obviously really useful. This was a point where I wasn't really confident in main decking it just because of how many decks were limiting their trap cards, so I decided to side deck it. This deck had Rose Archer and Koma Shroom already, and this was actually for the Mirror Match as well. I talked about that a little bit during the profile, but MST is really good in the Mirror Match because you can hit the Miracle Fertilizers. Interesting thing about MST, and something that most people made a mistake with, and I'll comment it on it here in case you go back and play this format, if your Sylvan opponent ever plays Mount Fertilizer, just Typhoon it immediately. Most people read Mount Sylvania and they're like, oh, it's a cost to discard a plant. I'm going to use my big brain and chain my Typhoon so that you go down -1. Well, great. Your opponent just discarded a Hermitry off of that Mount Sylvania cost, and now they're going to Sylvan Charity and then Mount Fertilizer, and they're going to bring it back, and you put a Sylvan in the graveyard when it didn't need to be there. Almost every occasion with this deck, the plant is better in the graveyard for the Sylvan player than in their hand, so just Typhoon Mount Sylvania immediately. Pro tip. Then we have double Chalice. The Chalices were specifically for the artifacts. It was one of the only ways of dealing with Moral Tech, but that card is also decent in some of the other things that that deck was trying to do. You know, you could hit a Curry Bandit, Fire Fists, you could hit Myrmelio. So the double Chalice gave you a going second out to Moral Tech, and even Beagle Tech too. Sometimes when they Beagle Tech combo you, it could be really frustrating. Double Royal Decree. Decree was really important in this deck against a lot of those trap matchups. One of your main ways of winning was just going Decree Spark Dragon. Your opponent has a little difficult time because you can protect the Decree. If you watched the most recent video with Sylvans against, I don't think it was actually the most recent, I think it was the one prior when I played Sylvans against Hat, you'll see the match where I basically won the game by protecting my Decree off a Spark Dragon with Engineer. So that iteration there can win a lot of games. And then double Light Imprisoning Mirror, really to push the Lightsworn matchup over the top. I was really afraid of Lightsworns at that year's Nationals, so I had a lot of cards in the side deck for it. I ended up only playing against it once, but I did beat it. This card, though, is also the other card against Buijin, so it had a little bit of utility where this card was actually really good against a combo deck and really good against a light-based control deck. But nevertheless, that is the side deck. Just because I made a comment on it during the video, I'm just going to show you really quickly the bread and butter turn 1 play. Just in case you've never, ever played Sylvans or seen Sylvans, I'm talking about this like it's a combo deck. Well, what exactly can this deck do? I am going to just show you the most simplistic bread and butter play that this deck can do, and then you can judge for yourself how good it is. So let's say you opened Soul Charge, Lone Fire, and literally nothing else. So whether that's Rivalries, Hand Traps, Rose Archers, Maxis, you have no other types of extenders, no Mount Sylvanias, nothing at all. What can these 2 cards just do all alone on their own? Well, Lone Fire can obviously go and get a Lone Fire Blossom, and then that Lone Fire Blossom can go out and get Hermitry. Then you can use the Soul Charge to bring back both of your Lone Fire Blossoms. Then your Lone Fire Blossom can use the effect and go out and search a Princess Sprout. There's some discussion here as to whether or not you want to use this Lone Fire Blossom. If you plan on using Spore during this turn, then you probably should, but you can go out here and grab Spore, just so that you don't draw it. But then you can use the Princess Sprout and put it on top of your deck. Let's say, for example, you know you want to use Spore. This is what you would do. You would use Princess Sprout. I'm not going to put Sage. I'm going to put Rivalry in the graveyard just because I don't want to extend the combo beyond just the simplistic. Put the Sprout on top of your deck. Use the Hermitry to send it to the grave to draw a random card. And now the Sprout can come back as a level 7. And then here you can go in to start a Spark Dragon. That's one of the options. This isn't really the best option, but it's one of the things you can do. And then you can have Spark Dragon Hermitry. Pretty reasonable, but let's get even better. And a draw. That's the key part. I just got a draw out of this. But that's definitely not the only thing you can do. Let's start back. Lone Fire. Puts Hermitry on the board. Now we Soul Charge back out the 2 Lone Fire Blossoms. Well, this one can be used to go and get Spore. This one can be used to go and get Sage. Now you can put these 2 into Stardust Spark Dragon, and then you can banish the Sage from your graveyard to summon the Spore, and now these 2 can go into Felgrand. Now you're foregoing a draw and making it so that you use your Spore, but obviously this board is really hard. Against decks with hands, you put these in defense and your opponent has a really difficult time dealing with this, because that 18 plus 2,000 defense is higher than any of their monsters. They would have to put, obviously, Moral Tech in attack mode, but that's not going to happen on turn 1. So that was one of the things that you could end with. Let's say you wanted to end with Hermitry and Felgrand. We can go back a little bit. Of course, starting with these. Lone Fire, tributes off to get Lone Fire, tributes off to get Hermitry. You use the Soul Charge, bringing out these 2. This Lone Fire can be tributed off for Princess Sprout. This one can be tributed off to get another Hermitry. And then you can use the Princess Sprout to put it on top of the deck by milling a random card. Again, I'm just going to put Rivalry in the graveyard so that we don't unnecessarily extend in the middle of this. Put it on top, tree effect, special summon it, draw a random card, make it a level 8. These 2 go into Felgrand, and then you actually still have one Hermitry effect here where you could draw an additional card. So now you have the ability to draw an additional card and end on Felgrand. So you have a couple things there. You can either get an additional draw and end on Spark Dragon. Let's say you open Decree. An additional draw and end on Felgrand, you think that's really good. Or if you're willing to forego the draw, you could turn the Hermitry into a Spark Dragon and end like this. And again, that's just a 2-card combo. Chances are you have an extender in there, Mount Sylvania to stack something. And when you start having Mount Sylvanias and make it so that you guarantee plants on top of your deck with Hermitry, you can end up comboing out really easily. But that's just bread and butter, most simplistic look at some of the combos in Sylvans. It's been Giorlando looking at, honestly, my favorite combo deck of all time. I hope you enjoyed this deck profile as much as I enjoyed recording it. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! Content from 2014 and, of course, a variety of other formats.